So, welcome everybody to the Animals and Society Colloquium and to our November Colloquium. My name is Carol Glasser. I help manage and run the Colloquium series through my role as a member of the Animals and Society section of the American Sociological Association. If you are a sociologist and aren't a member of the ASA and the Animals and Society section, please send me a message. I would love to give you more information about that. This Colloquium series is also co-sponsored by the Culture and Animals Foundation, CAF, which our speaker today was actually a grant recipient of CAF. So it's particularly exciting today that we have Zipporah Weisberg here to present. CAF is a really great organization, and this is an organization that, regardless of what discipline you're in, you should really know about and be a part of. So after the talk gets started, I will pop some information about CAF into the chat. A little bit of information about today's event. We're going to have a speaker and it will be followed by a question and answer session. I will be monitoring the chat throughout. So during the Q&A, if you want, you can raise your hand and I'll call on you to ask a question, or you can just pop your questions in the chat and I'll read them aloud. You can feel free to use the chat during the event as well. So, without further ado, I would like to introduce today's talk. Today's talk is Sanctuaries and the Politics of Refusal, being presented by Dr. Zipporah Weisberg. Zipporah is an adjunct professor in the Department of Classics and Religious Studies and the Interdisciplinary Program in the Arts at the University of Ottawa. From 2023 to 2024, Dr. Weisberg held a limited term appointment at the rank of Assistant Professor of Critical Animal Studies in the Department of Sociology at Brock University. In March 2021, Dr. Weisberg was awarded a Culture and Animals Foundation grant for her project on animal agency and animal sanctuaries. Dr. Weisberg completed her PhD in social and political thought at York University in 2013 and was the inaugural postdoctoral fellow in animal ethics in the Department of Philosophy at Queen's University from 2013 to 2015. Her areas of specialization include critical animal studies, the critical theory of the early Frankfurt School, and existentialism and phenomenology. Dr. Weisberg has published on a wide range of topics, including climate justice and animal justice, the ethics and politics of cultured meat, the benefits and harms of animal-assisted therapy, the ethical and ontological implications of biotechnology, and the psychopathology of speciesism. She's currently working on a book project on sanctuaries as a form of political refusal. And I'm very excited today to have Dr. Weisberg present some of her work that's related to that. So with that, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Carol. I really appreciate it. Thanks so much for the invitation. Yes, I want to give a shout out also for the Culture and Animals Foundation for funding an earlier portion of this project when I did some research at Vine Sanctuary. Thank you also to Vine Sanctuary for that, to the Animals and Society Colloquium series, and to the Animals and Society section of the American Sociological Association. Also, just to plug Vienna Animal Studies, which is a group that I co-founded with a number of wonderful scholars in Vienna, Austria. We're doing some exciting stuff. If you happen to be passing through or would like to share some of your work in an online lecture series that we're also starting sometime in the near future. So yes, there's half an hour today. I'll try to get through everything, and then hopefully we'll have some questions and some discussion after, so you can pick my brain about some of my ideas. So this project started really out of an intuitive impulse and kind of experientially in terms of having dealt with a lot of traumatic responses to witnessing horrors, of animal exploitation when I was an activist, watching footage and spending many years, as we all do as animal advocates and scholars, observing and analyzing the atrocities that are now commonplace and growing, unfortunately, in scope and scale. And so I started shifting some of my attention to sanctuaries as a healing, as part of the healing process in a way. Also, just love spending time with animals, but sort of politically and intellectually, and ethically as well, I was interested in sanctuaries for the alternative that they provided. And it was very clear to me early on that sanctuaries were much more than just refuges, that they were safe havens, and they did provide that necessary and urgent support for what we might call refugees from the atrocity apparatus, the animal industrial complex, and also residents. They're not permanent refugees once they arrive. But I felt that there was something else going on that wasn't being acknowledged in the movement as much as it should be and in the scholarship. So that's what prompted this research and this project, which is now turning into a book, and I'm very excited to share it with you. It's been going in stages, step by step, and hopefully within the coming couple of years, a book will come out of this. Let's see how it all goes. So my argument, as you can see here, is that sanctuaries are important players, both materially and symbolically, in the animal liberation movement. I want to make that very clear. I want to state that outright because I don't think sanctuaries get the credit they deserve. They're often regarded as secondary or marginal places where maybe just a few animals, the lucky ones, can be saved, but otherwise they're not really supporting the larger cause. And I actually disagree with that. I think they are very fundamental to the overarching cause of animal liberation. Following Ilana Brell, who did some of the earlier work and really influential work in animal sanctuaries, according to him, a sanctuary is both, quote, a specific bounded place or state of being and an ideological, ethical mode of being. And I'm really intrigued by this definition of sanctuary because it goes beyond the idea of safe haven or refuge. It acknowledges that. So the material element of sanctuaries, and that is something actually that I talk quite a bit about, is very much connected to the symbolic aspect of sanctuaries, to the power that they hold politically and symbolically. But I like to think of them as both at the same time. So both a bounded place or state of being, so a specific location, also a state of being in sanctuary. Sanctuaries are a kind of more than just a space. They're also a state, right? Because they're transitional. And that's something to emphasize as well. They're not end stations, as Eva Meyer says, but they are transitional spaces. The idea is to eventually create the conditions for not having to have sanctuaries. But they're both of those things, a place and a state, and an ideological and ethical mode of being. So their way of thinking as well. They're a new form of consciousness, we might say, or at least they create the conditions for developing a new form of consciousness. And that's what I'm excited about more than anything. And a form of consciousness and an ideological persuasion that is, of course, ethically and politically informed. As I mentioned, first and foremost, they provide the urgently needed care and refuge for survivors of the horrors of the animal industrial complex. And I really applaud people who work in sanctuaries. It's extremely difficult work. I'm like a terrible volunteer. When I go to volunteer, I always feel like I'm in the way because I'm just not good at that kind of manual labor. You have to be very tough. You have to have a thick skin to work in a sanctuary, and not just because of the physical exertion that's required and the working in inclement weather, but also because of what you are encountering, the suffering and that you witness, and the work that needs to be done to rescue these fragile and severely injured and traumatized animals. So I really think that sanctuary workers should be applauded repeatedly and continually for their incredible sacrifice. And it's not to sort of, create a concept of martyrdom here. And there's obviously a great benefit to working in a sanctuary as well, but it is not easy work. And I think it's important to acknowledge that straight up. Like human sanctuary cities, I would say sanctuaries are also, quote, an act of solidarity with marginalized communities and an act of protest against harmful policies and practices against vulnerable communities. Sorry for the typo there. And that's, I'm basing that on an article that I came across on sanctuary cities. And I do see, even though we might want to address sanctuary cities differently, there are different questions that come up when it comes to human sanctuary cities and that whole concept, and obvious material differences and symbolic differences. But there's certainly a sense that a sanctuary as such, at least how I conceive it, is an act of solidarity with the animals that are victimized in our society, and also an act of protest. Yeah, so they're engaging in action, even if they're not necessarily overtly committed to radical politics, for example, or engaging in protest per se in the traditional sense. I think that their existence is an act of protest as well as an act of solidarity. So, of course, animal sanctuaries are diverse and imperfect institutions, but what institutions are perfect, right? And I think I overstated that somewhere. I read that I had written, I was reminded that I had written that they are deeply flawed institutions, and I actually feel that that's too strongly stated. I don't think sanctuaries are deeply flawed. I think they're imperfect. in the way that any institution is imperfect. And they are subject to the imperfection also comes out of external constraints that are placed on the sanctuaries, not because there's something intrinsically flawed about sanctuaries. Perhaps there is, in the sense that they necessarily confine animals, that they're subject to certain limitations, and they are dealing with an imperfect situation, which we might also say, following Dinesh Wadiwell, is a war against animals, right? So any space of resistance, the underground, right, where there's rescue and refuge and recuperation in a state of war, it's going to be an imperfect scenario. So I want to also provide that disclaimer so as to not give the wrong impression that I somehow feel there's something otherwise fundamentally wrong with sanctuaries. Of course, they vary depending on the kinds of animals they house, the resources they have at their disposal. And I know I maybe was a little bit too preemptively, I was too concerned about kind of preemptively defending myself against accusations that I'm romanticizing sanctuaries. But I do understand that they are, it's very difficult to talk about sanctuaries in the abstract, but I've made that choice here. When I'm talking about sanctuaries, I'm generally, in my mind, in my own imaginary, thinking mostly about the sanctuaries I have the most contact with, which are sanctuaries for formerly farmed animals. But I will be going to a sanctuary for vervet monkeys, for example, soon, and hoping to broaden the research to spend time at other kinds of sanctuaries. And I do have all sanctuaries in mind. But when I speak of sanctuary, I'm also referring specifically to vegan sanctuaries. So when I'm talking about the sanctuaries that are ones that really provide the most comprehensive protest against the system, those are explicitly vegan sanctuaries. But otherwise, I'm not focusing on differences at this point, just because it would be impossible to follow this line of argument if I were to go into so much detail. So just keep that in mind, that I'm aware of the imperfections. I'm aware that a sanctuary for elephants is going to look very different than a sanctuary for rats, for farmed animals, for formerly animals that were experimented upon, etc. And some sanctuaries are much better equipped. So you might have a sanctuary that is run by someone who cares very much about animals, but doesn't really have the resources to create an optimal environment. I've definitely come across sanctuaries like that, where it's a bit of a moment, because you know that the person means well, but they're animals that don't seem to be as well taken care of as they should be. On the other hand, they're free, they're loved. But still, it's obvious that there's a huge spectrum, right, in terms of amounts of funding. It comes down to an economic question at the end of the day. And they may not, they may have to restrict animals in smaller spaces and so on and so forth, less than the ideal. Still, I would, at least if the intention is good and everything is done that's possible to make the animals' lives as enjoyable as possible, I still would consider those to be valid sanctuaries in the way that I'm describing them here. Not the pretend sanctuaries, the fake sanctuaries, right, that give you rides on elephants. Those don't count in my definition. And of course, sanctuaries are forced to participate in the system that we live in, right? They can't escape it entirely. Elana Brell has done a great job talking about this. Ear tagging, buying from, farm supply stores and so on. It's all part of the same system that we're actually trying to overcome. So those limitations are clear. And finally, as Miriam Jones, co-founder with Patrice Jones of Vine Sanctuary in Springfield, Vermont, has noted, the best sanctuaries can offer is a fake freedom. I would say that that term actually is maybe, it overstates it, or at least sounds maybe more negative than I would say, because I think it's maybe an imperfect freedom or an incomplete freedom. I wouldn't maybe go so far as to say fake freedom, but since Miriam Jones herself has so much experience running a sanctuary, I feel like I can trust also her position. So what I'm interested in is the political promise of sanctuaries, and this is something that has emerged now as an area of study. People have started to become aware that sanctuaries have a lot to offer, despite their intrinsic limitations. People feel that sanctuaries are places where politics, animal politics, can start to take shape. Political philosophers Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlicka were among the first animal studies scholars to explore the potential of sanctuaries to engage in meaningful political praxis beyond rescue and advocacy. So they've written a number of articles on that, or at least one foundational article, and then there have been other collaborations since then, where they try to differentiate between certain kinds of sanctuaries. And they look at concrete practices, material practices like separating animals by species versus allowing animals to integrate in a way that's safe and healthy for them, and that enables a greater expression and exploration of agency and autonomy. So they draw that line. I think that's a really useful distinction. Others have argued that in addition to offering multi-species safe spaces, that's another term that's used, animal sanctuaries can be generative and transformative and foster new ways of thinking about and living with other animals. So there are others who have embarked upon this journey of exploring the political potential of sanctuaries and following in their footsteps. I'm just drawing on a slightly different tradition. Most of the thinkers that I'm familiar with draw primarily on the liberal political tradition, and there's much to be gained from that. I'm also trying to add in kind of another dimension politically by drawing from the Frankfurt School and Herbert Marcuse. Before we get to Marcuse, I just wanted to elaborate a little on what I was saying. So, for example, Donaldson and Kimlicka talk about the difference between a sanctuary in the traditional sense and a multi-species community. They focus on and point our attention to overtly political sanctuaries and politicized sanctuaries like Vine Sanctuary in Springfield, Vermont, which I mentioned already, a wonderful place, and such incredible work happening there. They don't allow just random visitors to come in, but they allow researchers to come in and students. So it's much more sensitive also maybe than other places to the needs of the animals, to creating an environment where it's not voyeuristic. They integrate animals across species, and they create spaces, physical spaces that really allow animals to kind of find their own way, including a space for cows to quasi rewild. They can't fully rewild for zoning laws and other reasons, but and it would be risky for the cows because the hunters. But they do their best to really turn the sanctuary into a political project in overt sense, and that's why one of the reasons Vine has gotten so much attention. So they really reject paternalism, and they explicitly define themselves as a multi-species community. And I definitely think that's the way to go. I think Vine is an excellent model for that. Eva Meyer, who mentioned already, reinforces the idea that politically engaged sanctuaries like Vine undermine hierarchical ways of thinking and acting, whereas maybe other sanctuaries unintentionally reinforce certain hierarchical ways of understanding relationships, right? And sort of assuming that what humans assume a kind of paternalistic power. Humans are the decision makers. And at Vine, even though of course in the end humans will make the final decision, they try to listen to what the animals are saying, and they have various strategies for doing that, which I can't get into here just as a result of time constraints. Pablo Castello, who also is someone who's doing a lot of interesting work into sanctuaries. He recently came out with a fascinating article on the fabric of zoodemocracy. He conducted 8 weeks of multi-species ethnographic research at Vine, and he argues, quote, that Vine, quote, captures some of the distributed political dynamic that is constitutive of the fabric of zoodemocracy. So some really exciting work going on there. Again, typically focusing on sanctuaries like Vine that have an explicitly political agenda. So I want to say that although I agree that Vine is incredible for its sort of self-consciousness, its awareness, and its commitment to political transformation, our other sanctuaries are also de facto political and are making a political contribution. So I'm not contesting the claims of these other scholars. I'm just suggesting that I think we, at least in the way I understand political, we can, we don't need to a sanctuary doesn't necessarily have to be defined explicitly as such, and it doesn't have to organize itself in one way or the other necessarily. Even sanctuaries that don't integrate species, for example, I would say are participating in quite a radical political act, and as you'll see, and as my title suggests, an act of refusal. So let me explain now for the remainder of the talk why I think that is. Again, just to reiterate, I do think the Vine model is exemplary, and hopefully over time, as in maybe if there's an opportunity for sanctuaries to unify more into a movement, there'll be more discussion about that. But I do think that sanctuaries are de facto all sites of political contestation and possibility. So let's go on and see what I mean by that in detail. So I think sanctuaries are an expression of refusal, are a form of refusal, are participating in the tradition of refusal as articulated by Frankfurt School scholar Herbert and public intellectual Herbert Marcuse. So my argument is that by virtue of their very existence, sanctuaries participate in the Great Refusal, which Marcuse defined as in the simplest terms, as, quote, the protest against that which is. Now, I have to add a caveat here. In recent years, my positionality a little bit is shifting in the sense that I don't know that it's always good to protest everything that is. I think the kind of a negative relationship to existing institutions perhaps is not always optimal. But I'm still committed to this larger tradition of refusal, protesting against that which is certainly with respect to non-human animals. So that which is for non-human animals is an ideology and infrastructure of violence and extermination, which is the culmination of 2 millennia at least of human supremacism and its marriage with capitalism. That is that which is, and that is what sanctuaries are protesting, I think. For Marcuse, quote, the liberation which must precede the construction of a free society is one which necessitates a historical break with the past and present. I also think sanctuaries represent a historical break with the past and present. Sanctuaries are perhaps the most conspicuous of historical breaks with the past and present, insofar as they are arguably the only places on Earth and in the history of our civilization in which animals' well-being without ulterior motive is the primary motivating factor of their existence to begin with. There have been sanctuaries in other communities, the Jains, whose tradition I've also studied and am returning to studying in more recent years. They also have sanctuaries, and that date very far back. But for the most part, the sanctuaries, we understand it, is quite a modern, contemporary phenomenon, and certainly one without precedent. In as much as around the world, and it's not just the West, but everywhere in the world, humans tend to have a violent, dominating relationship with animals. And if we keep animals in a space, we do that to exploit them. We might be nicer to them, or there's a spectrum of niceness and not niceness, and we usually fall somewhere in there. And I think sanctuaries are outside of that, even though some of the practices they engage in are, of course, objectively speaking, problematic. But that, I would argue, is the conditions at this historical juncture that compel them to engage in those practices. Sanctuaries, like other forms of refusal, are negations of that which negates us. And those are the words of Christian Garland. Negations of that which negate us. So what negates us? Well, human supremacism is a negation of our animality, first and foremost. Our whole self-definition is a self-negation, right? We deny our animality in asserting that we are human and not animal. We also negate our capacity for developing wonderful relationships, for mutually reinforcing relationships, for a life of enchantment, a life of wonder. Again, not to romanticize, right? I know in nature there's a lot of violence in nature. Well, among other animals, in undomesticated animals, there are obligate carnivores, there are predators. It's not all peaches and cream and soy cream, but certainly we have consciously denied pretty much every impulse that we have to create friendship with other animals, and to find a way to construct a society grounded in mutual appreciation, grounded in awe, grounded in wonder, grounded in respect. So that's a negation of ourselves, I would argue. Sanctuaries where humans and other animals often develop bonds of friendship, where animals' lives are valued in and of themselves, negate this negation. And in so doing, create the conditions for new forms of affirmation, another essential element of refusal. So refusal is not just a negative thing. It's a positive thing. Yeah, it's affirming that which affirms us. It's negating that which negates us. That's why I really like this concept of refusal, because it's not just destructive. There's a bit of a tendency, I would argue, in at least certain communities on the left in particular who are focused on destructiveness in many senses. I know that's a stereotype, but I actually think there's truth to that. So we have this idea of a kind of creative, erotic, in capital E sense of erotic space where new things can be developed, new forms of relationship, new forms of sensuality, where animality is embraced. So that's what interests me about sanctuaries and why I think they are de facto political spaces, even if they don't call themselves that or see themselves that in the way that Vine does, for example. So another element of refusal, a la Marcuse, is shifting from the performance principle to a new kind of pleasure principle. What are these principles? Well, the performance principle demands calculable output from the worker at increasingly accelerated rates, seeks to extract as much labor power from the worker at as little cost as possible, and expects the worker to work tirelessly, quote, for an apparatus which they do not control. Capitalism, right? Of course, we all have different experiences under capitalism. We're not all factory workers, but we are all still subject to this logic of output, of performance, of productivity in this strictly capitalistic sense. And it's taken its own shape since Marcuse's time in the form of neoliberal global capitalism. The slaughterhouse is arguably the worst manifestation, the ultimate manifestation of the performance principle, both for the animals and for the human workers. And there are wonderful critiques of slaughterhouse dynamics. Timothy Patrat, of course, but from a different angle, the politics of sight. But critiques focusing especially on labor relations and on the way the body transforms, is self-alienated in the slaughterhouse under capitalism, and then the double alienation of the worker and the animal. And of course, the horrors that are taking place, right? That the workers themselves are undoubtedly experiencing trauma from participating in. And then, of course, for the animals, it's the ultimate horror. They're in infernal spaces where capitalism really expresses its most monstrous side. So neither instrumentalizing nor profiting from animals in their charge, sanctuaries serve no rational purpose. So they're outside and against the performance principle. The performance principle is about rationality in the economic sense, as much as in the traditional sense, cognitive sense. They have no rational purpose. There's no reason for a sanctuary to exist under the model of capitalism, under that framework, because they don't produce the animals don't have economic value. They're not contributing to growth. In fact, apart from having to buy the supplies that are required to maintain a sanctuary, but otherwise they don't serve any purpose under capitalism, and therefore they're in fact irrational spaces in that sense. And I think that's where their strength and their political prowess lies. They are joyfully irrational, not in a postmodern sense, but really in an anti-capitalist sense, in as much as they create the conditions for non-repressive, desublimated pleasure. Those are wordy words in Marcusean, Marxian thought. But it's just a way of saying pleasure that's non-exploitative, pleasure that's able to express itself without being forcibly channeled into work and without being produced or generated on the backs of others through violence and exploitation. It's pleasure that is non-exploitative in its expression and fulfillment. It is pure pleasure. Not to say that animals don't carry their trauma with them and that they don't struggle and have difficulties and have conflicts and fights. All of that happens, right? But there is a sense, as far as my research tells me, that sanctuaries are devoted to pleasure in a very wholesome way. And human beings sacrifice a lot for that, right? And there's a whole question around labor relations with human beings that we could get into. Well, it's not always great for the humans who work at sanctuaries, who volunteer. There can be exploitation. Again, they're not paradises, right? But in terms of the impulse and sort of the aim of the sanctuary, what I see happening, what I see unfolding is a space primarily devoted to pleasure. One might say that the pleasure principle is the principle around which sanctuaries revolve, more than just refuge, I would add. Pleasure. I'm almost at the end of the argument here. I think I have another 5 minutes. So the biological basis of freedom. This is another aspect of the Great Refusal that really fascinates me and that speaks to me, and I think is really true for and present in sanctuary. So what is the biological basis of freedom? Well, Marcuse defined it as a change in the infrastructure of man. in the psychic and sensual infrastructure of man. It's a kind of phenomenological argument in a way. It's the transformation of the human being at the level of instinct. We can challenge that term, the level of basic needs from someone who knowingly participates in systematized barbarism and willingly also to someone who is no longer capable of it. And I would see someone like Harold Lyman as an example. He's down at the bottom of the slide, just his name there. You may have come across him just somewhere in your advocacy or scholarship. There's a documentary, an older one, Peaceable Kingdom, that features him along with other reformed farmers who were committed to animal exploitation. That was what the tradition they grew up in, and that's what they did and believed in until they had a change of heart and devoted the same body and the same self to supporting animals and either starting sanctuaries, volunteering on sanctuaries, or going around the world and lecturing on animal rights, or all of the above. And so there's an actual shift that takes place on the psychic level, I think, for these people. And I don't mean to paternalistically psychoanalyze them, but it's a body where the hands that used to harm are hands that heal, hands that help. And so I think there's something really important about recognizing the embodied element of sanctuaries, the biological. That's what I am thinking of when I think of biological. It involves the replacement of false needs, which have been introjected into the subject, with the true need for sensual, aesthetic, and intellectual fulfillment. So false needs that are generated by capitalism, right? To buy this and buy that, and to not think about and not care about what happens to the animals behind the scenes. By biological transformation, Marcuse also means the process and the dimension in which inclinations, behavior patterns, and aspirations become vital needs, which, if not satisfied, would cause dysfunction in the organism. There's such a radical transformation that for any of us here who are vegans, I think understand on a deeply felt level, right? You can no longer even imagine consuming animal products. You can no longer imagine biting into, an animal corpse. It becomes what used to be a source of pleasure becomes a source of disgust. So it's a felt experiential shift that's at once psychic and embodied. The transformation would manifest itself in affect, posture, gesture, comportment, and sensibility. It's not again, postmodern understanding of a fragmented self. Rather, it's a self that comes into itself as a new being that's committed to that sees itself as alongside with being with other animals, as opposed to over and above other animals, with always that possibility of violence, right? Animals are available for violence in our society, and this would that undermines that. And when vegans don't look at animals as available for violence. Okay, just a couple, I think 2 or 3 more slides, and then I will get to the questions. So foundations for the new sensorium and aesthetic ethos. So there's something about beauty in sanctuaries, and there's something about ugliness in slaughterhouses, laboratories, places of violence, zoos, right? They repel us aesthetically. The biological shift then that I was just talking about would mean that the subject becomes naturally, i.e. physically, instinctually, psychically repelled by aggressiveness. That's Marcuse's term for violent aggression, which in this case refers to violence, brutality, and ugliness. Or we can also add maybe a kind of machismo, that sort of attitude towards other animals, where their vulnerability is what inspires violence towards them, right? Vulnerability here would be the source, would inspire care. So there's an ecofeminist element here that I'm not going to get into, but that's part of it as well. Marcuse's conception of beauty is not superficial. It's not about cosmetic beauty or prettiness. It's about goodness, right? And there's a tradition of this, of linking the good with the beautiful. Élisée Reclus, who I often cite, also has long passages on the beauty of peaceable relations with other animals and the ugliness of butcher shops, for example. Beauty is not only the harmonious union of sensuousness, imagination, and reason, but it also has an objective or ontological character as the form in which man and nature come into their own fulfillment. Those are Marcuse's words, and it's I think a beautiful way of actually capturing what is going on in sanctuaries, where there's a sense of mutual fulfillment. Nobody wants to go and nobody takes a day off and hangs out at a slaughterhouse. And that's or at an animal laboratory, right? We go to beautiful places where things are as they should be. Some people get a thrill out of watching animals kill each other, but that's a distorted experience of pleasure, I would argue, and manufactured by a masculinist society. But ultimately, there's something objectively beautiful about sanctuaries. Beauty, in other words, is the reconciliation of the human and the non-human, and as this suggests, beauty on this reading is inherently ethical. It's ethical beauty. As Marcuse writes, beauty has the power to check aggression. It forbids and immobilizes the aggressor. When you see a pig as beautiful in her authenticity, in her sweetness, in her there-ness, in herself, then you are checked. The impulse towards aggression almost doesn't even appear, doesn't even arise. Beauty transfixes us, but in a positive way. And it transforms our affect and our physicality into something gentle. Okay, this is just my last slide here, concluding thoughts. Sanctuaries, in my view, do not need to be politically active or engaged in any other way, is engaged in politics, let's say, to be sites of political transformation. They are de facto sites of transformation. They are not perfect, nor are they, as I mentioned earlier, end stations. We don't want to create a world where filled with sanctuaries only. That's the transitional stage. What we want are ultimately is a world where we don't have to have sanctuaries, right? But in the meantime, there are spaces of refuge and political spaces where humans can learn new ways of relating to other beings and experiment with forming new kinds of communities. So that's harkening back to the multi-species communities framework that other people have investigated and celebrate, and I joined them in that. The ultimate goal is to create the conditions for a society, as I said, in which sanctuaries are not necessary, where living in community with animals is the norm, not the exception. That's it. I think I made it. Wow. Almost in 30 minutes. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm really looking forward to your questions and any comments as well that you might have, and points of critique, whatever.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. The chat has been really active the whole time.
Oh,
So you've really generated a lot of conversation and thought. I'm going to have you stop sharing your screen if that's okay,
yes,
so that we can see you. And
absolutely.
we already have some questions in the chat, so, or at least one question in the chat. So as you all have questions, if you can use your hand raising emoji icon, I can call on you in the order that you raise your hand, and or you can put your questions in the chat. I'll start with a question that we already have from Rosa. This is, I'll read it verbatim. My current research involves a scoping review of policies and guidelines of rehoming research animals. And a major challenge often raised is that of scalability. For example, or in other words, the numbers in Switzerland show a vast discrepancy, roughly 1,000 animals rehomed annually compared to over 1 million animals used in research. When we consider sanctuaries as a force for systemic political change, how do you suggest we can reconcile this immense numerical challenge? How can the political action embodied by rehoming in sanctuaries move beyond this low percentage reality to genuinely influence the broader political and ethical calculus of animal research?
That's a great question. I wish I had the perfect answer for you. It's kind of like the $60 million question in a way, or billion nowadays. Millions nothing. But so I have a few thoughts that come to mind. So in terms of the practical side of things, that's not my strength. And I would really want to consult with folks who run sanctuaries like that to get their input, because those are also very specialized sanctuaries. You saw earlier a photo from Fauna Foundation, right, which houses chimpanzees that were used for all sorts of invasive research, especially HIV research. And so they know kind of from the inside what that actually entails. But I would argue that making a stink about it in the public, right? Publicizing this problem. So campaigning about this would be one important thing, just to show that distinction to people, and to show that there isn't we don't have enough policy infrastructure, if you will, in place, or enough policy or infrastructure in place to actually deal with that discrepancy. So that would be reaching out as much as possible to the wider public to make that known. And in the meantime, also there are really interesting projects. I actually forgot to put, I knew there was something, a transformation icon on my earlier slide. A transformation is a group that I'm a part of also it's based in Vienna, but there are other ones around Europe, and it focuses on convincing farmers in particular to convincing them to transform their animal farms into animal sanctuaries and or into plant-based farms. And so perhaps there could be something where a kind of initiative is developed to not it'd be complicated, right, when it comes to researchers, but some kind of collaborative effort where there's an idea funding being diverted to creating spaces for other animals, for different kinds of research to be conducted, right? So this is a huge topic, and it's specific to scientific research and the nature of scientific research and the money that's involved and the funding sources. But I think there's an opportunity maybe to think along the lines of that model as well, where instead of it being combative, because that's not really going to get us anywhere. The people with money are the ones that are going to make the choices. So maybe a little bit more collaborative and sort of convincing donors and so on to create spaces where some more animals could be housed, and then to create experts who could handle animals specifically that have been researched on, right? Who have special needs. Yes. Sorry, yeah, I see another question there, but I'll let Carol, I'll let you.
Well, we have Pablo's hand is
Yeah,
raised.
okay,
We'll go to Pablo next, and then I'll go
great.
back over to the chat.
Okay.
Hello, Zipporah. Thank you so much
Hi,
for
Pablo.
your hello. Thank you so much for your talk. This was super interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just have a couple of quick questions. So
Sure.
the first one was about, you said that I have this here in a screenshot. One might say that pleasure is the principle around which sanctuaries revolve.
Right.
I was wondering, well, like a sanctuary like mine, as you know, puts at the center self-determination, care, a lot of other things that are not necessarily pleasure, and that to me they
Right.
speak more to flourishing, some conception
Right.
of flourishing. So I just wondered what you thought about that, why you chose pleasure, and what you thought about perhaps centering animal flourishing rather than pleasure. Because I know your views on this, and pleasure often is very associated with utilitarian forms of thought, as you know.
Right.
So, it's a bit tricky. And then the other question I had was about, it's a strategic rather than a substantive question, about the term beauty. Because in the area of disability studies and certain disabilities, one could say they are not beautiful according to standards of beauty. I know that's not their conception of beauty. There are certain animals who may be very badly harmed, and then they may not be perceived as beautiful. So instead of that type of discourse, we have a discourse of what's good, what's just, etc. Of course, I know that you are not talking about beauty in that sense because you draw from Marcuse. But I'm always thinking about what kinds of terms can in the public sphere, advocacy, activism, be helpful
Right.
and kind of very easy to access and may not lead us perhaps to say, oh, what we need is a beautiful world where those
Right.
who are not
Right. Right.
beautiful. You know what I mean? I know that's not
Yeah,
how you are
I
using it. That's
do.
why my question is really a strategic question, whether we should use that term or rather use the substance of what Marcuse is saying with a different terminology, perhaps. But I'm not sure about this. So I just wonder, yes, what do you think about it? But thank you so much for your talk. It was fantastic.
Thank you. Yeah, great questions. Thank you so much. I had a feeling that that last line, which I just added this morning about pleasure, would be provocative somehow, because I know, having been, spent time on sanctuaries as you have as well, very even more time. Um, Pleasure is sometimes hard to come by, and it might not be the best way to frame it, given especially that there are some animals who don't really experience a lot of pleasure. Hens whose bodies are so broken, for example, they can barely move. I get that. This project, one of the things I have to be really careful about is not looking like I'm romanticizing things or glossing over the lived reality. When I say that, and I think I'll take your point to heart really when I develop this into the book, and then going to do a whole chapter on performance principle versus pleasure principle. I do mean pleasure much more broadly. So it's not just smiling and happiness. What I mean, though, is right. This we all aspire to, and I'm drawing also on the Freudian tradition, but through Marx and the Frankfurt School. So it's a kind of a different understanding, really, of these desires, right, and of our psychic life. But also, there is a sense that there's a drive that we have, right, to relax, to enjoy, to play. So I'm talking about creating the conditions for animals to do that when they want. I'm not talking about let's all, dance around all the time and isn't everything wonderful, right? But it's more that animals are almost never given the opportunity just to enjoy life for the sake of enjoying life because they are valued as individuals who are worthy of enjoying their life without any ulterior motive, right? We don't give them more space at sanctuary so that their flesh tastes better, right? Ultimately, so the idea is more an ethos that's pleasure oriented and it's reclaiming pleasure from capitalism. That's the other argument. So it's a kind of redefinition of pleasure outside of the really harmful understanding of pleasure that is generated by capitalism or perpetuated by capitalism and that results in tremendous amount of violence towards animals, right? Biting into that juicy burger, other forms of exploitation, right? So that's the idea, but I will think more about that. And I certainly didn't think about the link to utilitarianism, which is obviously not where I want to be going with this. So at the very least, I need to include a disclaimer around that and be much more precise in how I define pleasure. Beauty, same thing. And I also know that that is uncomfortable in a way. I love that you brought up disabled animals. This is another area that I'm, getting more and more interested in diving into, and something that crosses over a lot with animal studies is critical disability studies. And I actually would say that that's a perfect example of this understanding of beauty that I'm presenting through Marcuse, which is that it's not about cosmetic beauty, it's not about fitting a norm, it's about the fulfillment of selfhood, right? And it's about that any being with any shape is really truly beautiful. And I know it can sound sort of cheesy, and that's also something I want to avoid. But there is, I think, something primal for us animals about being amongst other animals that are fully expressing themselves, whatever their shape or form. That's why people can love rats who are considered ugly, right? And pestilential creatures, that we have new ways of seeing. That's part of the biological transformation. So the way that, at least the way that I'm interpreting it. So it would be reconceptualizing beauty much more broadly, but the foundational element really, or the sort of the crux, is that it's about it's an ethical understanding of aesthetics. It's an ethical aesthetics. So because you can make someone look beautiful and do a lot of harm to them in that process, whether it's decorating, a horse or an elephant for whatever purpose, right? It's for human gratification and not about the animal being fully beautiful in themselves. So I would have to spend a lot of time really explaining what I mean by beauty. But I think you're right to maybe I should think more about bringing in the question of flourishing and how does that relate to pleasure? How does that even relate to beauty? It's a really, really excellent point, and I'm going to make a note of it because I think there's space for that argument as well. Yeah, thank you so much.
Well, we have many more questions than we are going to be able to get to, so I'm going to prioritize people who have their hands up in this forum, and then I will send you, Zipporah, I'll send you the chat.
Sure.
And if you
Great.
want to connect with anyone, I have everyone's emails from registration, and you can connect with people that way. We have three hands up. I'm not sure if we'll get to them all. We have 10 minutes left, but I'll just go in the order that hands went up. So I'll start with Georgia.
Hi. Hi, hello. Thank you so much for your talk. I'm also working for my PhD project on sanctuaries, and I'm working on Italian sanctuaries. I'm doing oral history on them. And one of the things that came up during the interviews with people, either founders of the sanctuaries or workers and volunteers, is that they're trying to deconstruct this idea of sanctuaries as safe havens of
Yes.
places where everything is great, everything works magically, very, as you mentioned before, like overly romanticized. And it is also connected to what we said before about disability studies and critical disability studies, of the fact that animals who live there are like permanent residents, and they suffer from like long-term illness, or they have like complicated like lives, right? And do you think you will address this even more? Because you mentioned before the concept of beauty, but also maybe the beauty within the notion of care, that is not like straightforward, it's not easy, it's complicated. And whenever I write about this, I'm using the terms of like living or open laboratories where we no longer experiment on living animals by making them suffer, but we're working with them co with this the concept of co-authorship, and we're negotiating with them their health, their sickness, their life and death. So I'm wondering if you will also move towards that direction of deconstructing, sorry, it's late at night in Italy, deconstructing the idea of safe havens.
Absolutely. And I actually, I think I wrote so many versions of this paper, I don't even know what the last one looks like anymore, because this is based on an article that came out of the original research that I did through the Culture and Animal Foundation's grant. But absolutely, I know that people reject this idea of safe haven. And I in this version today, I kind of reinserted it because I do think that sanctuaries, they present themselves that way, and I want to take it from them in a way. But I want to add to that they're complicated places, and that they're not just that. It's not just about safe haven. And in fact, Donaldson and Kimlicka were the first to question that whole idea, right? That framing. But when you go to sanctuary websites, you see that they use that terminology that could be strategic, for promotional purposes. But to the depth of your question, to the real substance of your question, absolutely, I want to do at least a chapter. And in an earlier iteration of this paper, I had a huge section on the imperfections, if you will, of sanctuaries, without, saying from outside, oh, you do that so badly, more just recognizing the limitations that they themselves encounter. But because Ilana Brell has done such a great job with that, and I'm focusing, that's why I try to clarify that I'm focusing on the symbolic power of sanctuaries. It's tricky because then I actually talk about material practices, and someone else in an earlier in a reading group that I'm a part of that was giving some feedback mentioned this contradiction, that I say it's about symbolic power, but I actually talk about material and embodied practices. So I haven't squared that circle yet. And I need to figure out sort of how to properly do that. And part of it will be conducting more interviews as well, and really kind of asking and asking sanctuary workers and founders themselves, and volunteers as well, who are there all the time, sort of what the reality is. I did have an interview component in my previous project, which I just ended up not actually publishing that paper. I ended up creating something completely different. But hearing from the workers themselves, and they're harried and running around and covered in dirt and dealing with 25 things at once, and that's part of the interview experience, right? Seeing just how much of a struggle the work is, and then also when it comes to the animals themselves. There are many, many sad moments on sanctuaries, and I know I don't really talk about them here. So I'll have to figure out sort of structurally how I'll do that, whether it's just all in one chapter, like these are the real lived challenges, or if I'll spread it throughout. But it's definitely, there's no question that for my book to have any credibility, and for this argument to have any credibility, I need to be acknowledging and returning to the fact that these are places of anguish also. They are also, they struggle with hostile neighbors. Like a sanctuary that I volunteered at for a while was desperately trying to get money because the neighbors were trying to kick them out. They get attacked. There are, natural disasters. And so it's not like they're not utopias, and they're not safe havens in that sense that you walk into this magic door and then you close it and you're in the Garden of Eden. So I don't mean it in that way. And I think maybe I just need to be clearer about emphasizing that. But we should definitely talk. Your research sounds amazing. And there are a couple of sanctuaries in Italy, or at least one that I follow on Instagram. So I've never been there, but there are some neat things going on. Actually, there are two. I think someone from one of the sanctuaries, Simon, is here. So there's stuff happening in Italy that's also super interesting. So yeah, maybe we can connect later.
Well, you'll be happy to know that Simon posted that if you want to interview
Ah,
them, they'd be happy to answer your questions. So,
awesome.
so I'm
Yes.
going to
Okay,
send you
great.
the full chat
Yes.
after, as I know you haven't had time to be reading the chat. Unfortunately, we're coming up at the hour, so I don't think that there's going to be time for another question, and I'm very bummed about that. We have two people with hands up and a few questions in the chat, but we'll have to wrap it up so that all of you can get to the next thing that you're doing. But I always like to end all of these colloquium by giving our speaker a chance if there's anything they want to add or any last thoughts they want to leave us with, particularly anything that we as an audience should be doing about this topic. I'd like to turn it over to you for the last words.
Thank you. Okay, so yeah, my answers are really long, which is why what might be two questions ends up being just one. So I apologize for that. I would just say spend time. I mean, as animal people, you probably already do, but I do think it's important for our work for to heal partially and not using animals to heal us, but being with animals is healing when we're dealing with atrocities on a daily basis, and we need to address the trauma that animal advocates and scholars are experiencing. I think that's underreported and under-discussed because I know that it does impact a lot of people, certainly has impacted me. And I think that also spending time with animals in sanctuaries and critically also, engaging with what's going on in sanctuaries is important. I think we need to bring sanctuaries more into the limelight, if you will, into the and sort of pay a little more attention to them. So I think spending time is a great way to do that, even if, sanctuaries themselves aren't always as perfect as we'd like them to be. But taking a day here and there, taking a few weeks and volunteering because they need the help usually too. So that's what I would say.
All right, thank you so much for a wonderful chat. I hope that you all saw the link that Lisa posted to stay up to date. We haven't planned our spring semester yet, but we will have a full slate of colloquiums in the spring. If you're doing any work that you think might fit this colloquium series, feel free to send me an email. I'll pop my email up in the chat as well. We'd love to have some of you in the audience present in this colloquium one day. Once again, thank you so much, Dr. Weisberg, for a wonderful talk. This has been recorded, and all of you who registered will be sent this recording so you can watch it again, share it with your students and your colleagues. I'm sure there's other people who wish they could have been here and would love to see this talk. So, with that, I'll say goodbye, everyone, and take care. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Bye-bye.